You've pictured it, a Viking feast, roasted meat dripping with fat, overflowing horns of mead, firelight dancing across shields and carved pillars in a long wooden hall, laughter, noise, victory. It feels like abundance, like the very principle of Viking Age power. But most days didn't look like a celebration. They looked like discipline and survival. Most days consisted of a cold bowl of barley, thick and plain, dried fish, salted if you had that luxury, fresh baked bread, and a minuscule amount of butter if you were that fortunate. And that was just enough to make it till tomorrow. Because the real Viking life, it wasn't built on feasts. It was built on strategically rationing food to last. The truth is, Vikings didn't eat like conquerors. They ate like men and women who knew winter was always coming, who understood that one bad harvest could erase a year of hard work or an entire life prematurely. And what they ate, it wasn't random, it was deliberate. You could say that every bite was calculated. Every meal was the proper portion, because the strength to row across oceans, the endurance to fight on foreign shores, the will to stand when others collapse, that didn't come from the desire for silver or victory. It came from the fuel that they ate every day. Today we're opening up the menu to the Viking Age and looking at what they would have set on the table to feed their warriors and the entire civilization. We'll touch on feasts held in grand halls, but we must start with the quiet mornings, the long winters, the meals that didn't make it into the sagas. Because if you really want to understand the Viking world, you don't just start with their battles. You start with what fueled them. We're going to break down piece by piece, bite by bite, what the Vikings actually ate at home and what they carried with them across the sea. There's myth, and then there's the reality of the so-called Viking diet, the foods they depended on, and the ones that they prized. We'll look at what a Viking feast actually meant and why those moments mattered far more than just eating. And then we'll ask the question, did Vikings have anything even close to dessert? We'll find out. But realize underneath all this talk about food in the North, there's a deeper thread running through this entire story. Because this isn't just about food, it's about survival, discipline, and the system that allowed the people to thrive in a harsh world and on the battlefield. And what about Viking Age recipes? Can we find them? Can we track them down? Can we cook them up and impress our friends? Are there foods that you can eat today that will connect you with the Norsemen of the Viking Age? If they looked at your plate, would they recognize it as their own? Well, let's start with what a Viking table might look like, sound like, smell like, and taste like over 1,000 years ago. Evening settles in over the Danish coast. Inside, the hearth is alive. A woman moves about, stirring the pot hanging over the fire. She flips a cake on a flat stone in the hearth surrounded by red-hot coals. Steam and smoke fill the house with the scent of flavor. A trestle table was situated near the end of the hearth. The table already held a wooden bowl of butter and a stack of dried stockfish. The oak bench creaked under the weight of a warrior preparing to depart the village at dawn. This was the last meal he would eat from the comfort of his own home, because after this, he would dine on distant shores or in Valhalla. The pot rocks gently over the flame from one last stir before dinner is served. The rich barley thickening in the hot bath of herbs. It had been simmering for a few hours, which means the barley had softened into something pleasant and easy to consume. The smells are rich and earthy. The scent of bread, herbs, and the fish are making the warrior anxious for a taste. His senses are anticipating what they might have considered a feast in the moment. Most nights they would have had one, maybe two elements, but tonight they would have a little bit of everything their menu had to offer. The woman dips a ladle without looking, keeping an eye on the last cake of bread on the stone. She feels the weight of the ladle, the resistance of the stew, and the timing is perfect. She removes the hot cake from the stone, sets it on the table, draws the ladle, filling the wooden bowl for her husband. The dark barley flatbread stacked 5 high on the table. It's warm and ready to eat. The barley stew is steaming on the table, too hot to eat, but the warrior tries anyway. Defeated by the scorching hot temperature, he moves to the warm flatbread. With a modest spread of butter, he takes the largest bite he can, mouth full and trying to chew what is firm and tough as a leather boot. He smiles across the table at his wife. His wife smiles back and tears a small piece from her loaf and eats it. She is slow and calculated with her portions, not out of necessity, not today, but out of habit, from a lifetime of measured, intentional portion control. She reaches for the fish and offers a stiff, dried fillet to her husband. He reaches out and he tears a firm piece of meat. The fish is deposited in his mouth with the remnants of the flatbread, and the combination leads to a grunt of satisfaction, a pleasing sound to his wife. With his giant calloused hands, weathered and aged from dirt and time, he takes up his carved bone spoon and makes a second attempt at the stew. This time he figures it's ready and doesn't hesitate to take everything that the spoon has to offer. He quickly realized the heat remained, and now, with a half-open mouth and a wife who couldn't help but giggle, he tried to maneuver the food around his mouth, looking for relief until he could muster the courage to swallow. As soon as the stew went down, he followed it up with mead from his tankard, mead dripping from his mustache. He slammed the tankard down on the table. Mead splashed out of the cup onto the table because he was in a hurry to eat more of his wife's fine stew. This time, he raised the spoon. He waited a brief moment before consuming, and the next bite was much less dramatic. The rhythm continued. Stew, mead, bread, fish. This was the meal that would fuel his journey. Health and strength were his best chance of success as he faced whatever awaited him beyond the horizon. What was left would be packed up and sent with him tomorrow. The dense bread and dried fish would be his fuel until the raiding party could obtain rations from the locals or the land. This is exactly what Vikings would have experienced on countless occasions. What we just envisioned was a warrior's last home-cooked meal, and each were key parts of the Viking Age diet. What he had was the foundation of everything they ate, the primary source of protein and the king of calories. Food was fuel, and they needed a lot to survive and leave their mark on history. This section isn't about Viking Age indulgence. It's about quiet consistency. And that consistency is what won battles, allowed them to go on their voyages, and survive winter. So if you could travel back and sit at a Viking table, there's one thing you would be guaranteed to see: barley. Barley wasn't just a crop, it was the backbone of Scandinavian survival. It grew faster than other grains, tolerated poor soil, and could withstand the shorter growing seasons of the north. You say, well, what about wheat? Too fragile, too demanding, too temperamental. Barley was just like the people of the north, tough, and it didn't complain about its poor environment. From barley came thick porridge, most likely eaten every day. And because it was a grain, they made rough flatbreads, and they would cook them on hot stones or iron plates. They also made extremely dense, dark loaves of bread that could last much longer than any of their softer counterparts. In some regions further south or to the east, you could find oats and rye. But barley ruled. It was the very foundation of the Viking Age diet, and it suits them perfectly. It wasn't soft, it wasn't fluffy, it wasn't like the breads we have today. This was dense, tough, and gritty. Fish was the primary source of protein, and protein is what made them strong. Cod, herring, and salmon were the most common. That doesn't mean that they didn't eat other seafood like shellfish or other types of fish, but what they ate was the easiest to catch in the greatest quantities and where they would get the most protein for the amount of effort required. Here's something to keep in mind. These fish would have been pulled from icy waters that could kill you as easy as feed you. And unlike red meat, fish wasn't an occasional treat. It was constant. The most common form of fish was the stockfish. Stockfish was cod, dried in air until it became as hard as wood. And here's something remarkable about stockfish. It could last years, literally years. It didn't spoil easily. Not only that, but it could be eaten like fish jerky, or it could be rehydrated to have a softer texture. Fish was a pillar of survival and strength. Realize this: during the Viking Age, you didn't ask, "What's for dinner?" You already knew. So here's one myth that we've broken. Vikings weren't powered by red meat. They were powered by fish and grain. Now, if you know anything about dieting or looking at a menu and it says this meal has X number of calories, well, calories are a way to measure the energy stored in food for you or for a Viking to use as fuel. Living off the land as farmers, fishermen, raiders, travelers, it required the right amount of calories to keep going. The king of calories during the Viking Age, it may surprise you, dairy. And dairy wasn't just a side dish. It was where sustained energy came from. Skyr is the Viking form of yogurt. Skyr still exists today in Iceland. And if you've had it, you've tasted something straight out of the Viking Age. So then how do you make it? Well, you heat up some milk, you add some culture, or add a little bit from the last batch. You let it ferment and thicken. The process takes about 12 hours. You strain it, and you have a protein-rich, calorie-dense food. Super simple and easy to repeat. You could even make it yourself today. Dairy also gave the Vikings access to cheese and butter, neither of which were universal because butter requires a surplus of milk, which meant you'd have to have enough healthy livestock. You need a little more than what you needed for survival, so not everyone had butter, at least not every day. But that means that when they did have it, it was extremely valuable. Now here's something maybe you've heard. Vikings would eat as much as they could whenever they could to store up fat and calories for the winter. Well, did Vikings overeat for winter or for long journeys across the sea? The idea was eat as much as possible, store fat, survive winter or the long treks across the ocean or continents. Did that really happen? Not quite. In the north, they dealt with food scarcity, and it made constant overeating unlikely. Instead, they had a rhythm. Even if food was lean, they made sure it would last, which meant the diet was steady, not excessive. Survival came from preparation, preservation, and calculation, not body fat. So no bulking like modern athletes or gym rats. They just trusted their system to sustain them. And then you have vegetables. They don't get much glory or attention in the Viking stories. And to be honest, they don't get a whole lot of attention nowadays either. Just remember back to when you were a kid. But we all know that vegetables are essential. So most commonly you would find turnips, you'd find cabbage, onions, and leeks. These are all cold weather crops. And if you're in the U.S. today, think of the northern states, the cold Midwest, or even the northern mountain regions. In Canada, for sure. But in any hot climate, these veggies would struggle, which tells you something important. So most of the Viking food, it wasn't chosen for taste. It was chosen because it could survive. And it's what allowed them to survive as well. And before you think that their dishes were boring and bland, realize they had herbs to add a little flavor. They weren't necessarily seasoning like modern chefs or grandma, but they did use what they had. Dill, thyme, angelica. That last one may sound unfamiliar. I just think of it as a cross between celery and parsley. And then, of course, they had wild garlic. So now that we've gone through the most common foods that they had, that they would grow, that they would collect, now that we have all the ingredients from the Viking menu, we have a recipe for a nice fish stew with a barley loaf and some butter. But wait, what about red meat, or white meat for that matter? This might be the biggest misconception. Meat of cows, wild game, or poultry, it wasn't an everyday fuel during the Viking Age. They certainly had domesticated animals like cattle, sheep, and pigs. They weren't working with excess or abundance, so slaughtering an animal, it wasn't a casual task. Killing livestock meant losing milk, losing a potential worker for the fields, and losing long-term security. So this type of meat was always reserved for special occasions or feasts, and it was used very strategically. Of course, the people of Scandinavia hunted as well, which meant that depending on the region, they could end up eating deer, reindeer, elk, or birds. Smaller game like squirrels, hare. In coastal areas, you might even partake of seal or walrus. Even when they were after the fur of the minks or the fox, the meat wouldn't go to waste. But all that red meat and all that fowl, it was inserted into their diet when they had it, but it wasn't the foundation. It wasn't a consistent part of their daily life. So the pattern here has emerged. Grain daily. Fish probably almost daily. Dairy, very consistent. Vegetables, supplemented and frequent, added to dishes frequently. Red meat or birds only on occasion. Now back to picturing the Viking Age feast. We can picture the halls of Valhalla. We can picture the chieftain inviting his guests and throwing a party, the one where they did indulge. And they ate exactly how we've probably pictured it a time or two. Moments where meat was prepared in abundance and burly men would grab a hunk of meat off the bone and tear into it like a barbarian. We can picture these feasts where ale filled horns and the party was loud and boisterous, where one horn leads to another and the feasting just continues until everybody is fat and happy. But realize this, those types of feasts, though they did happen, they weren't just about food. They were also a display of power, status, and seeking loyalty. Your best chance of seeing one of these types of feasts was if a jarl or a chieftain held one, and they were very few and far between. They only happened on or during certain seasonal festivals, so midwinter. They may have happened after successful raids or battles. They happened for political gatherings, trying to gain alliances or negotiations. They may have happened during weddings and possibly religious ceremonies. Even then, you'd have to be a warrior, extremely loyal to the jarl, or a group that the jarl sent on some summer raid and you came back with treasure overflowing out of your longship. The only other people that they would have invited would have been those they were seeking influence with to make political connections, to make allies, and then maybe, possibly, skilled craftsmen, a famous world-traveling trader, or a skald or two. Beyond that, it might be tough to receive an invite to such an event. So if we could transport you back to the Viking Age and you could follow a Viking through a single day, this is what you would see. Nothing elaborate, that's for sure. But you'd see the rhythm. The morning, it would come early and it'd be cold. The first meal, it'd be simple, that leftover barley porridge. And maybe if you're lucky, you could reheat it. There would be hard, dark bread, and then maybe some of that special Viking Age yogurt we were talking about. But that would only be if the animals had something to offer. So you'd have a little bit of that, nothing heavy, just enough to get going. Then by lunch or midday, it would all depend on the work. The farmer in the field might pause briefly, have a piece of dried fish, some chunks of bread, maybe a swig of ale or some water. A fisherman would eat most of his meals on the boat. They'd all be quick, efficient, not full-blown lunch hour. This wasn't about relaxing and sitting down for lunch. It was about energy maintenance. The main meal came at the end of the day. That's when the hearth and the pot mattered most. You'd see stew if there were enough ingredients to combine, or you'd just have that simple porridge again if there wasn't vegetables to be added to the stew or any herbs to go along with it. And it would be in the evenings when the families would gather. They weren't celebrating, they were surviving, but they were doing it together. Portions during the Viking Age mattered. No one was racing for seconds. Leftovers were important for the start of the next day. Eat your dinner and then sleep for the night. That was the rhythm, because it's hard to sleep on an empty stomach. But then again, to the Norse, hunger wasn't an emergency. It was something that was all too familiar. And that right there may be one of the hardest parts of the Viking life for us to wrap our heads around. They understood what it meant to be hungry. Now, back to the Viking Age menu and the everyday meals. If you found yourself living in Scandinavia during the Viking Age, you most certainly would eat that barley porridge, thick and heavy as you could handle. Not the kind of meal that would excite you, but the one that would keep you alive. Then there would be the flatbread with smoked fish, a very simple dish, extremely portable and easy to obtain. Just tear off a piece of bread and fish and you're good to go. If you wanted to bring that boring dried stockfish back to life, then you throw it in the pot, you make some fish stew with herbs. Better yet, you give the pot whatever you caught fresh that day, and you've got yourself a nice fish stew. If you're feeling rich for a day or celebrating something significant, then roast a lamb and make sure you share with someone you might need help from in the future. If you decide to live outside of Scandinavia with those who settled in Iceland or Greenland, then you'd be used to fermented shark. The taste, as sharp as their teeth. The smell, pungent and unforgettable. This was food only for the bravest consumers, or maybe the desperate. And if it's just you and a handful of buddies sitting around a table telling tall tales of adventures and exaggerated exploits, then dried fish with a mug of ale, that's all you need. And that would have been the most common part of a laid-back gathering. Bone broth soups were made when the meat was all gone. A little on the watery side, but you're just making sure nothing is wasted. And if it's the right time of year, then a handful of wild berries could go a long way to provide a little sweetness in an otherwise harsh world. None of their menu was gourmet. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't graded on presentation. But it kept the Viking Age alive in a world that was trying to kill them in more ways than one. Other than the berries that we just mentioned, did the Norse have dessert? Well, no, not the way we think of it. There was no final course, no plate of sweetness waiting at the end of a meal. But they definitely had honey. Pretty sure they used most of that for drinking. And they did have wild berries, which could be mixed in with the skyr for a tasty sweet treat. Occasionally, porridges were sweetened with honey, so sweetness existed in limited forms. And to eat anything sweet was an exception, not an expectation. Now, here's something interesting. Some of the foods that the Vikings ate didn't disappear. They may have changed a little and adapted, but all of the ingredients that we've talked about survived, which means you may have eaten like a Viking without even knowing it. So wait, did the Vikings have recipes? Did they chisel their dishes into a runestone or write them down? No, at least not any that we've found so far. They obviously didn't have cookbooks like today. The Viking Age was almost exclusively an oral society, so passing on recipes would have been by word of mouth. And because they were simple and not very complex, they were pretty easy to remember. But realize this, anytime you eat a simple stew, especially if it has barley in it, or a barley flatbread, a fish dish with minimal ingredients, you've connected with the diet of the Viking Age. Not only that, but what they ate was surprisingly healthy. But here's what I want you to remember. Back in the Viking Age, food was not a choice. It was what they needed to survive. There wasn't much thought put into meals beyond the calculation to make sure they had enough for the week, the month, or the whole winter. They ate for survival. Every ingredient had a purpose. They engineered food systems that fit the North climate and fueled their expansion. Drying, fermenting, storing without refrigeration, and making what they had stretch as far as it could go by using every last bit of it, including boiling the bones. They wasted nothing. Things have changed since then. Now, we often can't decide what to eat, what to cook, or to stop off for a quick bite. We eat when we're bored, or for comfort, not because we need to, but because we feel like it. Many parts of the world waste an enormous amount of food. Many people, kids, and adults have become very picky eaters, selective in what they will consume. Their taste buds have become the primary decision maker as opposed to, if you don't like it, too bad, because that's all there is. I'm not saying a limited menu is what made the Vikings tough, but not having options certainly didn't make them weak either. One major thing that's changed over the last 1,000 years is that during the Viking Age, the people were very connected with what they ate. They knew where their food came from. They grew it. They milked it. They hunted it. They traded to get it. They churned it. They prepared it from scratch. Very few people today have that same connection with what they eat. Most of us have no idea where the food we consume comes from, or the process that it goes through to produce it. Food doesn't take much effort today. Now, I don't say that to make anyone living in our modern age of technology and efficiency feel bad for taking advantage of these luxuries. But I do want us to realize so that we can connect better with the Viking Age and what it meant to survive, and gives us a glimpse into their mindset. Their food was never guaranteed, which meant they respected food because the economy of nutrition, it was fragile. Here's a random thought you could try. If you know you have Viking Age roots and DNA, why not try the foods that fed them? And when you do, picture yourself eating what the Norse ate. Pick up some barley. Look for some dried fish. Prepare some bread. Make some simple fish and herb stew. Eat what they ate. Eat how they ate. Maybe just for a meal. Maybe for a snack. But let me just warn you. Whatever you do, stay away from the fermented shark. Not that you'd have an easy time finding it. You may not realize this, but your taste buds, they're still rooted in the Viking Age. And your metabolism, it may very well be designed for the foods of the North. And then, let me just say, I was slightly disappointed to find out that dessert was severely lacking during the Viking Age. Other than berries and a bit of honey, there were no pastries, no cakes, no ice cream, although I can imagine a child connecting the dots with snow and honey at some point during the Viking Age. They didn't serve dessert at the end of a meal, and they didn't drown their sorrows with a tub of ice cream. That all came later. As Europe moved through the medieval period and into the early modern age, food began to shift from survival to experience. Dishes took on more complex flavors, sugar became more available, cooking and baking evolved. And eventually you get something like one of my favorites, Norwegian school bread, a Norwegian pastry filled with custard and topped with coconut. Unfortunately for the Vikings, this soft, sweet, addictive treat is a modern creation, originating somewhere in the 19th or early 20th century. Even though it's not from the 9th or 10th century, it was created by direct descendants of the Viking Age. Therefore, we can postulate that had the Viking Age continued, eventually they would have made their own sweet discoveries. And if you ever have a chance, you should definitely try school bread. Now, add to everything we know about the Viking world, the ships, the battles, the legends, and now their diet. This all puts you in the top 1% of Viking Age knowledge. Can you believe that? How many people know as much as you do about the Viking world and what they ate? The Viking Age diet definitely wasn't about flavor. It was solely about function. Every meal had its job. Every bite had a purpose. And if we look at the Viking Age, many of those warriors would have been considered elite athletes. They didn't have personal trainers or dietitians to help them bulk and then cut. They just simply had a diet that worked and allowed them to fuel, to go, to fight, and to inspire us in many ways. So the next time you sit down to eat, pause for just a moment, look at what's in front of you, think of the Viking Age, be grateful for abundance and choice, and then think about the Viking Age warrior who is eating his last meal at home the night before he steps onto the deck of a longship to sail south across the sea to foreign shores where danger is waiting and where the outcome is unknown. And know that to this warrior, food was never just food. It was fuel. It was strength. It was the driver of life that moved in only one direction, forward. If this episode fed your curiosity about everyday life in the Viking Age, then share it with someone who has a hunger for knowledge. Because this isn't just about the past. This may be the best example of you are what you eat, and it's connected to real people who made waves in history. So until next time, be bold, be strong, and awaken the Viking in you.